The concept of the depressive position here involves the ability to hold a relationship where both good and bad aspects of people and oneself can be tolerated. When he is reminded of his loss, he momentarily connects with this state. However, the painful feelings trigger another narcissistic retreat back into typical narcissistic defenses, such as the rage, devaluation. And why does he go there? To avoid these feelings. He returned to his psychic retreat where he was no longer maintaining a genuine contact with me or himself. And you heard, right? When did this happen? What did you hear? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, we're going to continue our discussion on two complicated concepts I introduced in the previous episode, and I quote, the depressive position and what we call pathological or narcissistic organizations. Last time, we explored the depressive position, a challenging yet developmentally necessary state of mind that involves facing loss, accepting limitations, admitting one is wrong, yes, I said that, and relinquishing control over others. Of course, as you recognize, these are all very challenging characteristics, let's say, that a narcissist would acquire. So in other words, this is not easy for someone who struggles with narcissistic characteristics. It's really important to understand all of what it meant to enter into the depressive position and what happens when you or a loved one in your life makes a meaningful and genuine connection. See, that is actually the depressive position. I defined that a little bit in further detail in the prior episode, so you may want to go back and check that one out. But let me start off with a question for you. Have you ever wondered, does my partner or someone who's important to you really care about me? At moments, we're so connected, but at other times, I feel like I don't really matter to them. Conversely, have you ever asked yourself, what happened to my own deep feelings of connection or love? Yes, you can blame the loss of love on your partner. Oh, he's not the man I originally married. Or when I first met her, she was not so negative. But beyond this level of understanding, you have a feeling that something is going on inside of you that accounts for this shift in your capacity to maintain a loving relationship. I'm asking you to consider, and I'll make the argument, that these feelings and doubts you are having may be related to, again, this is a narcissistic organization. And I'll define that. Don't worry. We'll get into it. Since the concept is a bit abstract, let me get into it let me break it down. And then when I break it down, I think this way we could really see what we're calling narcissistic organization is all about. Think about a time when you felt deeply connected to someone. What happened when that connection was broken? For instance, maybe they got upset with you about something, or they needed to travel for work, or they didn't want to take a vacation that you had in mind. Those are all little breaks that happen every day. It's sort of like the vicissitudes of everyday separations. When this happened, did you pull back from them? Did you walk away? Or perhaps you became defensive or angry? For now, just to keep this clear, let's think about the narcissistic organization as a retreat. See, I'm trying to break it down. So when we think narcissistic organization, you could think somebody's preoccupied, like narcissistically preoccupied, and we're calling that a retreat. This retreat can take on many forms. Perhaps you don't assert your opinion about the vacation, or perhaps the retreat is into a narcissistic grandiosity and omnipotence. Wait, what is meant by, and I'm quoting, retreat into narcissistic grandiosity? And what does that actually look like? Painful feelings that can leave us feeling isolated, alone, ashamed, humiliated, anxious. You could fill in the blank here. Depressed, All of these are hidden behind a misleading, and I'm quoting that, misleading mantle of power, control, or invulnerability. See, that's the grandiosity. In other words, rather than face a painful emotion, it is much more comfortable and preferable, for instance, to say, I don't know, say to yourself that I know everything, or I know what happened in that argument. I know the truth. Do you hear this? This is actually what we're calling the narcissistic organization. Knowing everything is actually the narcissistic retreat. This retreat, in part, can comprise of these, and we could call these omnipotent fantasies, because you know everything. You have a claim on reality that nobody else does. You're convinced that your husband or your wife, significant other, spoke to you in a certain way. In other words, since you had a feeling, it must be true. These are the omnipotent fantasies. I want to be clear. I'm not just talking about the overt, grandiose type of narcissism. For example, consider someone who has recently left home for the first time, or maybe they dropped out of school, or feels disconnected from their work. This person may develop an anxiously preoccupied state of mind. In other words, they're withdrawn from life and they struggle to engage with school, work, or relationships. This anxiety reflects a more subtle version of what is known, again, as the psychic retreat. So it's not that grandiosity, but it's more of a subtle, quiet type of retreat. While it doesn't appear as overtly narcissistic or omnipotent, they fail to connect in a meaningful way with others, with work, I said, or even with society sometimes. And remember, this part I really want to emphasize. This lack of connection is central to the concept of a psychic retreat. This is the narcissistic retreat, the lack of contact. I'm just giving you examples. I'm just trying to demonstrate that it takes on many different forms. Have you noticed moments where you emotionally retreat from others when things become overwhelming? What does that retreat look like for you? What are some of your own patterns of emotional retreat? In their anxiety or depression, or even when they spend all day smoking weed, they remain emotionally distant. And you can hear this. That's the part that I'm really trying to zoom in on. I know there are fancy words. This is just sort of the psychoanalytic jargon, but the psychic retreat is that emotional barrier. That's when one is emotionally distant. In my experience, these individuals feel as though there's like a barrier. That's what I just mentioned. So there's like this barrier that goes up that separates them from others. This barrier or retreat, along with their intense self-focus, can feel like a safe, idealized haven from the overwhelming or frightening situations around them. What would it be like for you to stay present in moments of discomfort instead of retreating into familiar defenses? Again, whatever they may be for you, you could fill in the blank there. I just ticked off a number that occurred to me and what I see most frequently in my practice with these individuals. How does someone relinquish this deeply ingrained mindset, you may be wondering? How does one come out of this psychic retreat, this place of safety, and let go of something that has become so entrenched in their way of coping?
Welcome to Practical Wisdom for Leaders, the podcast where we help you become a great leader. I'm Dr. Scott Allen, and each week I engage with world leaders, senior executives, nonprofit trailblazers, and professors from universities around the globe. We explore all aspects of leadership: executive development, personal growth, bad leadership, women in leadership, decision-making, and so much more. Tune into Practical Wisdom for Leaders for critical insights to help you lead and live with purpose.
Let me try to answer this question about letting go or coming out of a psychic retreat with an example. I think examples are usually helpful. It grounds us in a certain way that we can't always do with sort of these psychological or theoretical concepts. So here's a fictitious patient. While the details have been altered for privacy, the therapeutic process and the insights that I'm about to share are from real experiences in my practice. A patient arrives for session quite angry. His wife is sick and he's feeling frustrated that he now has to attend to her needs. As this is explored, in other words, as I'm exploring his frustration, he becomes enraged with the idea that his wife is sick and is demanding more attention and care. Slowly, as I help him get into a more regulated state of mind, right? Because when someone's angry or accusing or labeling somebody, it's not possible to begin to think about and reflect on one's own self or other representations. In other words, how they view themselves and feel about themselves and how they view others. It gets quite distorted when you're in a dysregulated state of mind. So as I say, always, you heard this before if you've listened to this podcast, the first order of business is to slow this down. I call his attention to how he briefly alluded to there being, and I quote, no care for me. In other words, when he was in his rant and complaining and upset and frustrated, he said, there's no care for me. Slowly, his thoughts turn to, and he expresses that he feels, and I quote, guilty about the way he was attacking his wife, and he's concerned about her health. And yes, by the way, people with narcissistic characteristics can experience guilt and concern. This sort of shift, right, in his way of feeling, you could feel it, by the way, when you're with somebody like this. This enabled a different type of contact with this fellow. And I could feel that he was more able and willing to tolerate the idea that his wife has her own needs separate from his needs and that he wants to meet her needs. By the way, this brings us back to the question we started with earlier in this episode. Does my partner really care about me? There are moments when we feel so connected, but at other times, it feels like I don't matter to them. You see, I had the feeling at this moment in this session that he was both feeling more connected to his wife, and that's why people sometimes feel like, even though they're living with a narcissistic partner, that they really are connected, because in reality, there are these moments. And I felt it with this fellow, that he was more connected to his wife. He was more connected to me because he was calming down. He was in a more reflective state, and he was feeling a bit of compassion and guilt over the way he treated her in his mind. So he was more connected, and as he was able to express more genuine and vulnerable feelings, the mood shifted. He was hoping that in this relationship, all of his needs would be met by her. This is what we started to talk about. Now, with her being sick, we came to discover his fantasy was punctured. He was forced to face a loss, to return to reality. Again, always painfully difficult for someone with this grandiosity, that all of his needs are going to be attended to. And one might say he needed to leave his fantasy psychic retreat. So I'm back to that word again. But that's what we call, this is an example of the psychic retreat, where all of his needs would be met, and of course, without delay. What followed was another critical point in this session, as he was reminded of a recent experience when he was in contact with a young man who was dressed professionally. As he recounted this story of how this guy has money and success, but not, he added, because he earned it, but because it was handed down to him. Again, this is a fantasy. This is just a fellow he came into contact with on the bus or on the subway, right? So this guy, he was complaining now about this guy, and he was getting himself into a rage. And I'm quoting again, is spoiled and is an idiot who never earned anything in his life. The attack continued, But the main point I'm trying to demonstrate is how he, the patient this is, and I think you could probably hear this, and I actually called this to his attention, is sitting above this guy. In other words, he's now full of judgments and is looking down at this undeserving idiot. In this very brief example, can you see how he retreated? What's the psychic retreat here? What did you see? And where did he go? I'm asking this question because in terms of treating or relating or healing from NPD, this is really important to consider. And, in my mind, I think this is important because if you can see how and why he retreated, you are in a much better position to help him return to reality. In other words, to relate to somebody like this in your life. If you're recognizing this retreat, how do you relate to somebody like this? But first, you have to recognize it. If you think about it, have you ever caught yourself in a similar moment, retreating into anger or judgment? Is it possible that you were feeling vulnerable? Returning to this specific example, let's break it down. He begins the session in a state of rage, feeling neglected by his sick wife. This rage acts as a defense against the underlying sense of what? I said it earlier. Did you pick up on it? The underlying sense of loss and helplessness that he experiences when confronted with the idea of not receiving the care that he thinks he deserves and that he desires. One may argue he immediately rids himself of these painful feelings. Remember, this is a painful loss. By doing what? Becoming angry at her. This can also be thought of as a narcissistic rage, something I spoke about in a prior episode. That follows what? A narcissistic injury. So this fellow is actually injured because his wife is sick. I know this sounds ridiculous in your mind, but these are the kinds of experiences that people who have these vulnerabilities go through. At this moment, his rage serves to protect him from confronting a painful reality. Remember, the whole thing here is about a psychic retreat, a narcissistic retreat. So now he's forced into reality. I help him get in touch and into a more regulated state of mind. I mentioned this earlier, and you may have noticed this yourself. He then, what happens? He begins to feel, and I quote, guilty and compassion for his sick wife. And I said this, but it's worth repeating. Yes, with proper treatment, a narcissistic individual can experience guilt and compassion with proper treatment. He shifts from rage to a more reflective state where he expresses concern. This indicates a brief move toward acknowledging separateness, where he starts to recognize that his wife isn't there solely to take care of him, a very good prognostic sign. This shift allows him to temporarily tolerate the feelings of loss and sadness, marking a movement away from the narcissistic retreat. So this is all wonderful. He's in a really good place. As painful as it is, this is a good place to be. In terms of tools and techniques, this is one of the goals. When working with narcissistic individuals, we want to help integrate, right? And again, you may have heard me say this before, but one of the goals is to integrate, split off intolerable feelings. So that gets them more in touch with themselves and with other people. The concept, again, going back to where we started, and I quote, remember I said the depressive position, that's a good place to be. Remember I said that, a more integrated place to be. So the concept of the depressive position here involves the ability to hold a relationship where both good and bad aspects of people and oneself can be tolerated. When he is reminded of his loss, he momentarily connects with this state. However, the painful feelings trigger another narcissistic retreat back into typical narcissistic defenses, such as the rage, devaluation. And why does he go there? To avoid these feelings. He returned to his psychic retreat where he was no longer maintaining a genuine contact with me or himself. And you heard, right? When did this happen? What did you hear? This happened during a moment of contact. He shifted back to omnipotent defenses when he spiraled into an attack on the guy with the suit. Remember that? So he was in a state, in that depressive position, we could say. He left the psychic retreat. He was no narcissist. He wasn't using his narcissistic defenses. There was genuine contact, but it was too much for him to tolerate. And then he retreated. So the attack on this guy was designed to reverse feelings of what? Whatever they were. Humiliation, whatever. You heard how he then projected his own, and we could say what the feelings were because we see it through the projection, by the way. What did he project? His own inferiority and worthlessness onto this stranger who was not worthy of the status he had in life. He didn't earn it, and he was an idiot. This example nicely, I think, illustrates how when one is vulnerable or when making genuine contact with reality, right, with another person, one can make use of a variety of defensive and aggressive maneuvers in an attempt to reverse the humiliation, right? Because that's what he put on that guy who's an idiot and, inherited all this money and doesn't deserve anything. He completely shamed this guy, again, in his mind. And that returned him once more to where? Do you know what he returned to? I think you got it, but just in case, this is the narcissistic psychic retreat. So he's back in a place of what? Safety. The therapeutic goal, or if you're trying to relate to somebody like this in your life, is to help someone like this, right? Or even if you're noticing this in yourself, to stay in touch with these feelings without retreating into rage, devaluation, or wherever it is you tend to retreat. I mentioned anxiety, depression, alcohol, weed. You get it. So now you may be asking, how is it possible for me to progress in life, or how do you help someone relinquish this narcissistic retreat? I imagine you may have the answer to this already, but just in case, if we think back on that session that I gave an example of, through understanding and respecting why you or someone you know may feel safe in their current state, you can now begin to more closely track these critical moments that I tried to illustrate in that example when there's a retreat, right? From genuine contact, right, into a safer, albeit narcissistic state, but it's safer, remember? It is at these critical moments, right, that you begin to question what motivated the shift to anger or drinking. Again, whatever the retreat may be, you already know that while the retreat makes you feel safe, it also comes with a price. In short, recognizing, labeling, and thinking about the occasional movement in and out of the psychic retreat is a safe place for you to start. In other words, this is a safe place for you to start thinking about, how do I come out of this retreat? But you have to first notice, when do I go into the retreat and what precipitated it? Was there a moment of genuine connectedness with somebody? Movements toward the depressive position entail an awareness of loss and, for example, an awareness that your wife is not always there to meet all of your needs. There are moments of pain, shame, or humiliation. These precise moments are signs of progress, but as I try to demonstrate, they are precarious and therefore require a great deal of patience. What would it be like for you to recognize those critical moments when you've attempted to retreat and instead stay present with the discomfort How do you think that might change your relationships with others and with yourself, more importantly? This is no easy task. And this is where having a professional on your side can make a big difference. I'm talking about a psychotherapist who can help you recognize how courageous it is to allow painful emotions to surface, but an experienced enough therapist can also support you in noticing when you're beginning to shift away from these emotions. It's completely natural to want to avoid discomfort by retreating into old patterns, but it's important and necessary to keep in mind that this avoidance may be a return to your own psychic retreat. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a key takeaway. Recognizing these shifts, whether in yourself or someone you care about, is the first step toward real progress. Each time you confront these painful emotions, you're moving closer to a more authentic and fulfilling connection with yourself and others. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate these defenses overnight, but to gradually build the capacity to stay present with the discomfort, to understand why it's there, and to move through it with patience and compassion. With the right support and guidance, you can transform these precarious moments into lasting growth. As always, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding this narcissistic retreat, which is a very complicated concept indeed. I would like to inform you that I am in the process of planning a live event on YouTube, and I encourage you to join me for an engaging session, which is going to be with Lisa. If you've heard any of my prior episodes, I posted an interview that I had with Lisa, and she and I are going to do this live event. So stay tuned for that. I really hope you could join and bring all your questions about psychic retreats, omnipotent defenses, whatever they may be, any of the facets related to narcissism. This event is going to take place, we hope, fingers crossed, in October. But for more details, you can either email me directly or you could just visit my website. There's a tab there called Upcoming Events. There's a button that you could click on and it will tell you what I have coming up in October. All right, we have to wrap it up. Until next time, engage your mind and not your method of psychic retreat. Okay, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.